live chat on page?
Rujuta?
We can. So we can.
I mean, if we are, then I can look at that too. And if any questions come up
Yeah.
in that, I can just bring them here.
Where are you sending the link of that?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, all right. I'll send you the link here itself.
All right.
Okay, so we're live on YouTube. I will also share it on Instagram so that if people want to join, we can.
There are 8 people in the waiting room who we can let in.
Yeah, we can let them in. It's 7.
Oh.
Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for a couple of minutes to let everyone in. So we'll start in a couple of minutes.
Okay, all right. I think We can begin in a minute. I will just wait for. Yes. Okay. Um, so, welcome everybody to our discussion. I think calling it a webinar seems too formal on gender and music. Uh, this is a collaboration between Academicish and Eq.Vox, which stands for Equal Voices. So, Sanchi and I run Academicish, and it's something that began in the lockdown. Actually, it began in May 2020. Both of us have social science background. Sanchi is a policy researcher, and she focuses on cities and rights to cities and related concepts, and I'm an anthropologist. And our whole idea was to try and demystify academia to make it relatable to people who are not necessarily engaged with it professionally or personally, but are just interested in it and want to know more. And also to make it accessible, but also to contextualize it firmly within our context. So we were not trying to read texts that were written by, say, basically old white men about other countries or other continents or other cultures, to put it very, very I think briefly. So, this is one such effort we are making to engage with people outside of academia, but to understand how all of us are engaged in systems of meaning making, to understand the world and to make sense of it, basically. And we collaborated with Avanti, who is a classmate from St. Xavier's, where we all did our bachelor's from. And she is obviously, she's known, she's a semi-classical and also classical singer. We know her as a classmate, but obviously the people here know her as multiple other things, one of them being the founder of Eq.Vox. So Avanti will talk a little bit about Eq.Vox and the concept behind it. And yeah.
Thank you, Rujita. And yes, like you said, for me, collaborating with Academicish was something we had already spoken about a long time ago, just as I had started Eq.Vox. And what is Eq.Vox? Eq.Vox, like Rujita said, stands for Equal Voices. And this is something that was brewing in my mind for years, but I didn't know what form to bring to it. So eventually, I decided to take to Instagram to bring out the various voices that are not men in the music industry. The reason for this is there are lots of areas and verticals within the field of music that are highly dominated only by men. And that has no logical reasoning other than the fact that it has been happening for so many years and it hasn't been broken. So through Eq.Vox, I'm trying to interview and have conversations with artists who are working in the field. And that could be people who themselves write, who compose, who sing, who produce music, who are sound engineers, so on and so forth, and talk to them about their experiences. Because very often, what lies as a barrier in front of people is the fear of something that they don't know. So, hopefully, by learning about the experiences of the people in the field of music who aren't men, it'll help more individuals to represent themselves in the field of music. It'll give a push to people who think that this is only dominated by men, and hopefully more people will start to take on more varied roles in the field of music. And that's how Eq.Vox was born. And today, because we're also collaborating with Eq.Vox, I mean, Academicish is also collaborating with Eq.Vox, we have two people who have been a part of conversations on the Eq.Vox page, two friends of mine, Pavitra Chari and Rutuja Lad. And it's lovely to have them here because we've already built a lot of context talking about gender and music as to separate entities and how they coexist in the fields that we all are in, and spoken about it on Instagram. So it's nice to bring all of this together today in this panel discussion webinar, whatever we want to call it. So thank you, Academicish, for bringing this together and making it happen finally.
Sanji will just quickly introduce our, I guess, participants, panelists, and then we can start off with the discussion.
So, first we have Pavitra Chari. Pavitra Chari is a cross-genre vocalist, composer, and lyricist from New Delhi. A student of Hindustani classical music, she is a disciple of Srimati Shubha Mutkal. She is one half of the contemporary classical duo Shadow and Light, with three studio albums of original music released worldwide to critical acclaim. She is currently working on a study on the lyrical content or Sahitya of Khayal compositions as a research fellow at the Kolkata Center for Creativity. Thank you, Pavitra. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Rutuja Lad. Rutuja Lad is a Hindustani classical musician. Rutuja received her training in Jaipur Atroli Gharana from Pandita Dhondutai Kulkarni for around 12 years. Currently, she is being trained under Vidushi Dr. Ashwini Bhide Deshpande. She holds a master's in music from SNDT Women's University and is also working as a visiting faculty at the university. Thank you, Rutuja. Thank you for joining us. Then we have Avanti. Avanti is a Hindustani semi-classical and playback singer. She has also been working as a music educator since 2011 and holds a MA in Hindustani classical vocals from SNDT University. She is trained with Srimati Varsha Bhave for 20 years. Currently, she's training with Vidushi Dr. Ashwini Bhide Deshpande. She's also been top 9 in Indian Idol season 10 and top 7 in Zee Marathi Saregama Pa Lil Champ season 1. Thank you, Avanti, for doing this collaboration with us. Before we begin, I'd like to just quickly go over a few guidelines for this session to our audience. So we request everyone to keep themselves on mute to avoid any background noise. And if you have any questions you'd like to address any of the panelists, please put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll have time for an audience question answer session at the end. And we're also streaming this session live on YouTube. So if you know someone who wants to join the session but hasn't registered yet, they can use that link and go on YouTube and watch this video live. Trista, we can, Avanti, you can start with the questions.
Yes. So the entire discussion today is going to be divided in a couple of sections, and we'll be dealing with those sections one by one. The first of which is an understanding of the historical perspectives of gender and Hindustani classical music. The first question is actually addressed to Rutuja. And Rutuja, if you could unmute your mic. So, Rutuja, you've studied Hindustani classical music for years now, and also the history of Hindustani classical music. So, what do you think that from the gender perspective, which was the turning point in history for Hindustani classical music? Do you think there can be one such point defined?
Uh, I think while we, first of all, I would like to just thank Avanti for actually enabling me to converse on Eq.Vox with her, because that was kind of a breakthrough point in which made me to reflect on my journey of music and sort of reflect on the issue of gender and how I see myself addressing these issues. So thank you for giving me that opportunity, and also academicish to sort of personally to enable me to not be reserved about these are academic concepts, and I as a practitioner as a practitioner will I be able to address these conversations are essential, and which doesn't let us to view these two things as separate components, but sort of engages and encourages and a dialogue, which is very very important on both sides. So considering Avanti's question, I don't would say that I don't see a particular point or like a turning point in the history of Hindustani music, because it's important to understand the context and also in the way the art forms thrived in those years. So I would like to point and describe the issue of gender and the history of Hindustani music in the context of patronage, and focusing on the city of Mumbai. Taking the period of the 19th century and the earlier 20th century under the colonial rule, there were certainly challenges posed for the Hindustani music and musicians, as there was an absence of intercultural musical dialogue that indicates that British. Sorry.
Rutuja, you're still on mute.
Yeah, just sorry, I just got a call.
No problem.
Yeah. So yeah, so here, yeah, I was on the point where I'll be focusing more on the patronage, which on the issue of patronage. So there were challenges posed for Hindustani music and musicians, as there was an absence of intercultural musical dialogue that indicates that British residents did not respond favorably to Hindustani music. But however, it is important to acknowledge the private patronage and the role of Indian merchants in Bombay as patrons called Chetiyas, which provided migrant musicians with much needed patronage. So, documented evidence suggests that women performers were frequently featured more than male soloists in the mid 19th century uh, concerts. Performance practice followed by women performers in the 19th and 20th century would sort of appear discordant in the way we understood today, the woman in the way we understood today. So women performers were not allowed to perform through menstrual cycle, as they were considered ceremonially unclean. Also, the women from patrons' family did not attend the performances. So, though not widely acknowledged, women also acted as patrons, not only engaged male musicians as teachers and accompanists, but also featured in gatherings, which certainly allows us to view women as someone in the empowered position, as usually they are considered, someone who were not having that voice. But here we see the same thing in a different light. Although one cannot completely deny the stigma, which was a part of the social fabric, with the advent of national consciousness and a growing urge for social and political change, and the search for a national cultural identity, which sought to establish links between this system of music and a Hindustani Sanskritic past, had a sense of sanitizing the system, which considered the role of such patronage as immoral. So they considered music and dance performers featuring women performers as a social evil, and sought to stop them by leading. Uh, uh, so there was an anti-nautch movement in Madras and Calcutta in the 1890s. However, the movement did not find widespread support in.
Rutuja, sorry to interrupt you. Yes, go on.
Yeah, yeah. So, however,
Anti-nautch.
am I audible now? Yeah. So, however, the reformers in the city assumed the role of propagating this view. So, in general, if we address this issue, the quote by Justice M.G. Ranade perfectly sums the issue by as being caught in the midst of two civilizations living a divided and a conflicting life. So here I would just conclude your question by talking about the history of Hindustani music with respect to gender and patronage. However, I see that I don't claim that it's possible to address the issue in its entirety. This is just one aspect of addressing gender in the context of Hindustani music.
Thank you, Rutuja. I
Yeah,
actually wanted to ask a follow-up question
yeah.
which is open to Rutuja and Pavitra both, which is that she mentioned it in her answer itself that a lot of women had to go through a lot of stigma when it came to performance. And would you actually like to elaborate on the role of tawaifs in actually propagating Hindustani classical music? Because we've heard stories about founders of gharanas actually interacting musically with tawaifs in that time, and the entire process that you described of stigma and stigma attached to these women who were performers at that time. Would you be able to give us a little more context on how the life of these women was in that time?
Pavitra, would you like to go? Yeah.
Sure, I'll just share. I have a little bit of knowledge and I keep building on it as I keep reading and understanding more. But I feel like the immense amount of knowledge and learning that they cultivated through their representation of the art form, both as practitioners and also the knowledge of teaching and propagating future generations through the practices and the art forms, have, I feel like they left a really big impact in terms of everyone who came, to kind of see the performance, or everyone who was part of that culture. And it did, to my understanding, become uh, got stripped of a lot of its culture and heritage, and was pushed more towards societal ostracization, or looked at from a different point of view, perhaps also because, like Rutuja mentioned, the idea of patronage perhaps changed with colonization, with different financial, with different societal resource restraints that were kind of put on them. And so now I feel like we have a very altered understanding of the Tawaif culture. In fact, there's a book called Tawaif Nama that I recommend if people are interested to read. I had the opportunity to be a part of that book launch, and I got to learn a lot more in just those, few minutes of the launch happening, because so much of discussion was happening about that. So that's a good book to read more about it. Rituja, if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, just to add for the reference list, which my answer was mostly based on Hindustani music in colonial Bombay, which was written by Dr. Anish Pradhan. That book also gave me a lot of perspective to build on how Hindustani music existed during those times, about which we may not be aware, which we right now we may have an altered understanding about how those practices thrived at that point. But it's important to certainly review and reflect on the actual conditions which existed then, which sort of contributed to the way arts thrived. Talking about the Tawaif culture, which is so instrumental in propagating Hindustani music and as I mentioned, also there were the role of women patrons, which is not, these women patrons were actually essentially the tawaifs who helped and who helped to sustain. So that's how it is. And now when we say Hindustani music is all about that, we consider to sort of put it on a higher pedestal, where we like to sanitize the form by not allowing us to associate the form with such form of patronage and the role of tawaifs, which was so instrumental in the way arts propagated.
Thank you, Rutuja, and thank you, Pavitra, for summing that up very nicely. And moving to the next question, I'll actually ask this to Pavitra, which is that we're told so many stories about artists from our field, from the past, and some of these stories are almost shocking and unbelievable, but at the same time they have some essence of truth in it. So would you like to think about which story you heard maybe as a child or growing up through your journey in music which actually had an impact on you?
Yeah, well, this is particularly a story, and when I read or heard the idea of something that shocked me, this is the first thing that came to mind. So I'm going to go ahead with that. It's actually not a story that has happened to a person, but it's the story that I heard through a composition that Shivaji once was talking to me about, which was a really eye opener of sorts for me. And I'm paraphrasing, I might be wrong in and out, but you get the general gist. The idea of a woman who was kind of thrown out of her marital home for whatever reason. Perhaps she wasn't able to bear a child or something like that. And she was thrown out by her family, and she wanders out into the forest seeking solace or shelter in all different, she meets different animals and trees and living beings in the forest. And the song text describes each of the creatures that she meets, each of the living beings she meets, and that each of them, like a snake, for example, or a tree, or a fox, or an elephant, refuses to help her or give her shelter because they're scared that if she touches them or if they touch her, her barrenness is kind of going to spread onto them. And so they say, you know what, you kind of make your way back, you venture through this forest yourself, or you go back home. That might be better because we don't want to share the same kind of ill fate that you kind of have come in with or you possess. And as so much of this on so many levels is reflected on different parts of where we live and how we see things. Maybe they are really overt right in front of you, or they're super subtle and it's kind of disguised under years of custom or tradition or things like that. But that's a shocking story that that really had an impact on me.
Yeah, and I think it speaks so much about what was happening in society, and in essence also happens in society today.
Now,
But having a song talk about it almost validates it, I feel, because if people are writing about it, it's definitely happened, and it's happened more than once. So I feel like having songs and song texts describe these practices is a very interesting way of validating these issues that otherwise were not looked at as institutionalized, or were in any way given the kind of importance that they required. So I think this is a very interesting story. Thank you for sharing that, Pavitra. And the same question to Rutuja actually. Is there any story that had a very significant impact on you?
I won't say that there was a story, but it because the fact that I learned with Dondutai was a part of my musical journey, and which with the time when I learned as a young kid, it was more like a purely student teacher relation, and wherein you don't actually reflect on how your guru must have had the journey of her training. So right now, when I spoke to you also, Avanti, during when we were building on for our Eq.Vox interview, that sparked me the to reflect on the fact that how difficult or how challenging it must have been for Dhondutai to learn and to pursue a career in Hindustani music during those in that period. Essentially, because she belonged from a Brahmin household, and the way her family nurtured her training, wherein she was trained under Muslim ustads like Ustad Guji Kha Sahib, because when she was very young, she started her training, and the stigma which was associated then in learning music, which her family also sort of faced it, and still they nurtured her. Dhumbutai's training was something which sort of sparked, and it was. I never thought of this when I was learning. This never it sort of never impacted the 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 way it is impacting now as I reflect on her life as a student.
Thank you for sharing that, Rutuja. And you're right, very often there are things that we've just, seen as children and not realized the kind of impact they would have on us. Still, there comes a time when we retrospect and try and put it in context. And I think this is a perfect example of that. Moving on to the next question. This one is directed to you, Pavitra. So, we're talking about gender here, and I feel this is a very important question. According to you, has there been any historical representation of queerness in Hindustani classical music text?
Mm. Yeah, it is a really important question. And I must confess that my idea of venturing into research and also reading up about and getting to understand the historical, societal context on where all of this was built is quite nascent. But I'll still share thoughts that I have and have come across. And maybe that could be food for thought to start a whole other conversation. In my experience, I've not really read a lot of or any representation of queerness in specifically khayal music or Hindustani classical music in song text. But in my conversations with my gurus and guides, I've definitely, this conversation has come up. And there are some examples perhaps to throw some light on how this could be looked at. One is you have, at the same time during khayal, you also have ghazal compositions, right? And when you look at ghazal, especially Persian ghazals, which have a Persian influence, you do, to my understanding, find some evidence of same-sex love being represented in those texts. You perhaps also have, if you want to say, there are lots of specific gender roles that are ascribed in song text. This is what women are supposed to do. This is what men are supposed to do. Not much outside of the binary, but even within this, you have specific roles written. You do have, and you can say that when you're portraying a woman, you're portraying a lot of you're taking a lot from the naika bhed. You're also taking a lot from yearning and longing for a beloved who's away, who's not near you. So there's a lot of virahini, all of those characteristics come into play. But the same thing can be placed in the idea of ghazal, where mostly it is sung as a male, and it is sung about unrequited love or pining for someone or pining for the beloved. In some cases, perhaps it's mentioned that the beloved is female. In some cases, it's not. So that is something that was really interesting to me. And because you see two separate ideas of how love is looked at, male and female, and both are pining in this space. And perhaps the ghazals with the Persian influence have descriptions of same-sex love. But a third way of looking at it is also on compositions and sahitya where the gender is not specified, where it's just you could kind of ascribe your assumption on it or your bias, I would say, because that's immediately what I did when I also read a lot of them. I read, I'm like, oh, this is a woman protagonist who's crying because this is the reason, because I've been exposed to so much of the same kind of information my way. And I also had an example of a khayal composition that I thought I could share, where I have yet not found a specific indication of a gender description. And this is a Ram Rang composition, Pandit Ramashri Jha Ram Rang. So this is in Rag Yaman, and it says, Kajra kaise daru eri mai, mere to naina jhare piharwa bina, Janu na kaban e gun piya Ram Rang, ruse aena mandarwa. So the second I read the Kajra kaise daru, and I was like, okay, this is perhaps a female protagonist, because Kajra kaise dalu is mostly viewed like adorning yourself or putting makeup or any sorts of thing like that is usually almost immediately you kind of think of as someone who identifies as female. But in my conversation, I was actually asked the question, but why? In fact, Anish ji only asked me this question. Why do you think it's female? There is no actual indication of it being male or female. So I think that's the third perspective of looking at it. And we don't have any evidence to tell us that this was written for a female or having a female protagonist or a male protagonist or anything in the spectrum. We don't know that. So those are my thoughts on representation of queerness.
Thank you, Pavitra. And I'd actually like to add another thought over here because, like you said, we don't know. There's so much about the time in which these bandishes were written, these compositions were made, that we don't really have written evidence for. And the same, I think, is true of a lot of bandishes that were, now we know, written by men because they had their pen name in the bandish itself. But those bandishes talk about emotions, and the protagonist in the bandish is a woman, right? So here it's interesting to sort of take ourselves away from the obvious understanding that, okay, because this person was a man in that time, he wrote it and he ascribed these emotions to his woman protagonist in the bandish, and instead look at it as someone who was probably looking at it from a very gender fluid perspective, right? Why are we deciding that because he is a guy who wrote a bandish, he doesn't identify as, you know, more than a guy, or that he might have a slightly different gender spectrum, which maybe couldn't have articulated in that time through the bandish. But just the sheer number of bandishes written by men about emotions experienced by women, I feel, is an interesting question mark as to how that must have happened. And do we think about more than just the fact that we know this person was male and we know that these are emotions associated to women?
I have a couple of thoughts perhaps I could add here, which might add more to the conversation. One is about who were writing the compositions. And we, of course, have pen names which we identify from. But there have been some essays I've come to read where you also have different people writing, but using the pen names that are already prevalent. A lot of Surdas compositions have been written in that sense. So, firstly, we don't know if the person who wrote it also was the person who wrote it actually. And secondly, we also have compositions which are kind of closed up because of the anonymity of the poet or the author. So there we don't know if it was a woman or if it was somebody who identified somewhere else on the spectrum, or even someone who identified as male but sympathized, like you said, or empathized rather with the women. And also, perhaps when you have Khayal compositions itself, there is so much that I have come to understand that we have a lot of ideas of patriarchy and how things have permeated through our society by our experiences, but we don't actually know what the real situation was because we have nobody to come and tell us now that this is what happened. We also don't have people like Vagikars who we can ask now that you wrote this in that time. What were you actually trying to say? Was it a social commentary? Was it a metaphoric understanding? And where does gender play a role in that? So those are some more thoughts to add to this.
So I just want to slightly take from there, but if we had to take this similar idea of, like Avanti mentioned, men writing but writing about women, um, um, and this we can probably address when we talk about contemporary challenges. But today also we see a lot of men writing but writing about women, and we do see the problems that could come up when that happens. So maybe it's something that we keep away for a later point in the discussion. It's just something that came to my mind when you were talking about this. But we're moving from, say, the historical perspective to your personal experiences and say the politics of your experience as musicians, as someone who has received training. And I will start this question, I will address it to Rituja. And we'd actually like to know from Avanti and Pavitra about their experience with regard to this particular question. But the question is that in your musical journey, when was, say, the first time that you were made aware of your gender? Either assumed, like the other person assumed it, or whether it was the gender that you identify with. When was the first time?
Yeah, although it's quite difficult to sort of highlight one single stance wherein I was made aware, but I vividly remember that sense of, okay, I am like about the awareness of my gender was when I was briefly learning tabla for for a few years, and I was young at that time, and of course we had group lessons, and I was the only girl in the class, and of course I won't say that I felt that sense of being awkwardly placed, but I enjoyed a sort of that unique stance of being the only girl in the class. So I would not say that I was made aware of my gender, okay, you must behave in this way, or nothing of that sort. But I would say in a different way wherein I was learning tabla, and yeah, I was the only girl in the class. That's how that was the first sort of spark uh, me of me being aware of my gender.
Because I guess the gender representation in tabla players is so skewed,
Yeah.
um, that it came off as, and you took it also as a positive takeaway.
Yes.
It could have gone either way on that matter.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we'd like to hear, because these are stories, and stories can actually give us information. Like, I think the two stories that you shared about what impacted you but were about others,
Yeah.
this is the point at which we're trying to understand, in your journey, what is that story that you'd like to share. So Pavitra, if you want to talk about.
Sure. I don't remember perhaps the first time. There are many, many firsts of these. So I'll just go with the most memorable excerpts of these examples. Almost every time that I was asked, by event companies to share an image of myself before sharing audio works or samples for a gig was clearly a time I realized, okay, there are, layered understandings to these asks. There's also the time, the last, I think, year or so, I recently got married, and there has been a lot of confusion about what title must be given to me, what surname I should have. Is it a Miss or is it a Mrs.? And when I say it's a Miss Pavitra Chari, they're like, no, but what? There is no difference. How is that happening? And the question is the question that I get is that if I were identifying as male, I wouldn't have to change my title. Not that I have to now, but it's assumed that I wouldn't have to change my title if I were male, and also my surname would remain whatever it is. But there's an obvious assumption, and not all of it comes from a direct awareness of patriarchy or misogyny. It's also because that's the usual way of doing things, and it comes from good intent, and not everyone is out to get me, but it still did hit me hard every time. And every time I'm like, no, it's Miss and it's Chari. Let's move on to the actual song. But yeah, those are some instances that I'm made aware of quite regularly.
I think because we are trying to contextualize this in terms of academic understandings of reality, when you say that it doesn't always come from a place of misogyny or patriarchy, that's also because culture in its effect is so ingrained, is so, I mean, it comes naturally, right? It's sort of casual sexism, in terms of, you're not, the whole point of culture and being assimilated in a way of life is that you don't have to think about it constantly till you actually start to see the issues with it, wherein you have to work on it to fix that, maybe. And I think this is maybe our all of our conscious effort to work on the things that we see as problems. And in that sense, maybe moving on to Avanti and the fact that we are collaborating with Eq.Vox. And I think the first time we spoke to Avanti about this collaboration, she was like, I'm doing this, but I don't think it's research. And I think Sanchi and I had to tell her that when it comes to narratives, um, one narrative is enough. One person's case study is enough data, five people is enough. You don't have to reach a statistically significant number to then be like, this is a problem. So I think we sort of want to talk about how the lack of representation of, say, gender or caste or sexuality, what is the effect that it actually has on budding artists, on artists who don't see themselves necessarily in, in what are the celebrated artists of the generation, of the century. As a young person, as a budding artist, if you don't see yourself, you don't see that representation, what is the effect that it has? And since Avanti has been speaking to multiple artist, has been gathering multiple narratives, I feel like you could tie in and chime in what you have, I think, observed.
So I think the very first statement that you made, that because you can't see them, it's exactly that. The reason we don't have enough women who are sound engineers, for example, the reason we don't have enough women who play percussion instruments, for example, is because we don't have enough role models in front of us. We don't have imagery associated with these roles. If you ask anybody to close their eyes and imagine somebody who plays the tabla, they're not going to think of a woman. For that matter, if you ask someone to even imagine a music composer, they're not going to think of a woman. So this in itself gives us an insight into the fact that it's so ingrained that we need to make a change at its very core. We need to first start creating role models. So the conversation that I've had with so many artists begins right there, that you are a role model for a lot of artists, and because you are here, who composes, who writes, if someone listens to this conversation and maybe when they close their eyes and think about a composer, think of a woman, that's a win. So when you think about representation and role models, this is the first thing that I'd like to talk about. And with representation, we also have to consider so many other aspects. Like we've discussed, there's almost no or very little representation of queerness actually defined as queerness, right? In Hindustani classical music, or just Hindustani music, doesn't even have to be classical music for that matter. And that can be extended all the way to contemporary films today, where we have songs that describe emotions of men, right? We have songs that describe emotions of women. We have characters that play these roles in films and they sing these songs. But the only place where we have queer characters is to add humor. So we aren't representing queerness in music even today. And the same thing goes for another category which is very important, which is caste. When we look at Hindustani classical music, we have to remember that it was made um, it was made elite by people from upper caste society. It wasn't elite to begin with, because the very origin of Hindustani classical music lies in folk music, lies in so many other forms around it, which influenced it so heavily. But it became classical when a Brahmin or a Khan Sahib or a Pandit took it, right, and made it so. So when we look at caste representation in classical music, that's also a very interesting question mark as to how are these identities represented? Are they represented? And then if we look at, I remember discussing this with you, mridangam makers, right? Mridangam makers are all non-Brahmin. So the culture of making the instrument in itself is a part of a certain caste. But that is doing two things. Firstly, are they getting enough money to sustain themselves making that instrument? And why are they not Brahmins? It's because making an instrument involves handling animal hide, right? So it's assumed to be the job of a Shudra to actually touch animal hide and not a Brahmin. So these are all aspects of caste and aspects of representation in general that we need to look upon when we think about identity in music. And thank you, Sanchi, for posting it here. T.M. Krishna has a book, has written in a book, Sebastian and Sons, about mridangam makers, and it's something that you can give a read to and learn more about. But yeah, that's my answer to where exactly the problem lies. There is a lack of representation in every sphere here, and how that impacts us is something that we don't even consciously understand, because we're still at a place where we're dealing with conditioning. We're not dealing with problems that exist. People are not yet calling them problems. So that's the first issue to tackle.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And when we were planning this session, it came up multiple times. And I think at a point, it also has to go beyond representation and just be about space. like, is there space for people who don't belong to these select few groups, even if it's gender? And I think on Eq.Vox you do such a good job of saying that there is no space given to even anybody who's not a cis man, right? So representation will come when we create spaces also where such people are welcome, where such people, where anybody who doesn't associate themselves with these groups, with these high art or high music, or those sort of groups, can also be an artist who is doing high art for that matter. Pavitra, I'm quickly going to move to you in terms of what is the kind of role segregation that women are expected to adhere to in the industry, and maybe we can talk about the representation of women behind the scenes, so in terms of the instrumental or tech side of things. And maybe you could share your experience as someone who's part of a band or someone who performs also, with regard to that.
Sure, there definitely many such expectations. A lot of them, like we mentioned in the beginning, also not specified anywhere. There's no book written on it, but it's there in everyone's, like, it's like we're programmed that way with all the thought and exposure that we have. So for the longest time, I thought maybe this is in relation to we have some people, like when we have a category or a role like a drummer, it's heavy instruments, and is this something to do with the weight of the instrument or the bulkiness of the instrument, or the ability to carry it, which also didn't make much sense. But in either way, I thought maybe that was the reason. But most recently, the idea of sound engineers, like Avanti mentioned, has really struck me. And that has literally got nothing to do with any physical machinery of sorts, the actual work of it. But even that is seen as a highly, like, male dominated, male oriented kind of job, so much so that a lot of times I get to hear that she's a female sound engineer, and I'm like, that why? So much information in that one sentence. Firstly, she's a sound engineer, will do the job quite well, but we are in a space where we are seeing them, and we are constantly highlighting them as exceptions. It's a great starting point. I will not say that it's not, but I feel we are in a place where this needs to normalize. And we're open and okay with saying that's that's a sound engineer. See, even naturally, you end up with that coming in because you hear it so often. That's a female drummer, a female sound engineer. You don't hear that's a male sound engineer standing there. They just point, or they just say engineer. So that's one thing I've come across a lot in the industry. And I don't want to say that it's immediately changing or there's lots of change happening. I don't think that's the case, at least in my observation. I will say what I told Avanti in that interview, that people are beginning to talk about it. That for sure is there. And if there are spaces like Eq.Vox or Academic-ish and other platforms that allow for these kind of conversations to happen, then even if one person goes back with this thought, like she said, that's a win for us.
I think that's interesting because one sort of, you said you don't know why this happens, but it could also just be that music is art, but the technical side is more science or it's applied, and then suddenly how can you do this? Because we see this very often, and this is something that came up in our discussion with Avanti also, that when you want to follow music as a art, as a hobby, women are encouraged, girls are sent to singing classes or music classes. But when you say that this is what you want to do as a profession, you want to make money off this, you want a job off of this, you want to do this outside in the world, and suddenly those spaces are reserved for men, are reserved for very few women. And we can see this in a lot of our music, I think, concerts also. What is the lineup largely made up of? And it becomes a sort of binary between the inside the house, outside the house profession, that comes up again and again and again. Like, to give a very simplistic example, and just to sort of I think if you look at cooking, and I'm not saying cooking and singing are the same thing, but if you to look at cooking, the cooking inside the house is women do it, right? It's supposed to be a gender role, like women cook inside the house. But the minute you talk about professional cooking in terms of chefs, or cooking for large amounts of, like halwais, if I say chef, if I say halwai, we're all immediately thinking of men cooking. And I think several professions have that sort of, even to give you like the example of academia, if I say social worker, you'll think of a woman. If I say professor, you'd likely think of a man. And I mean, I think that binary of the spaces, again, we're coming back again and again to which spaces are habitable by who. It sort of, we come back to that. But I think, Avanti, you can flow in. Pavitra, do you have something to add? Otherwise,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think there's one thing that I need to think more about. Maybe you all can share some light on it about the wage gap or the pay gap, even in the arts industry. I know that it's been publicized a lot for films and cinema and those kind of roles, but I wonder what that is like for a male singer and a female singer or anyone else in the spectrum. How does that play a role, and how much of a difference? I'm sure there is, but how much of it are we talking about? Might be a question we can answer.
So this is interesting, Pavitra. I'd like to chime in here because initially, when I started doing some research for Eq.Vox, I was trying to find a lot of statistics, and mainly because I was also educating myself, right? And I realized that in the context of Indian music, there is very, very, very little data available. And the data that is available, I wonder how much of it is really credible, because it's all done like maybe by some magazine as like a listicle or something of that sort. So it's not necessarily academic data. So when you look at even things like a wage gap, I couldn't find any concrete data on whether or not it exists. Forget the fact that we're looking at actual numbers here. So again, it will go back to anecdotal evidence, and weirdly so, that people don't want to share how much they get paid, right? And that's another thing which I think is truly Indian, because when it's a simple and small thing, but when it comes to like talking about money, I don't know if this is just me or if you all have also experienced this, that there is some amount of, being reserved associated with it, or you have to do it secretly, or there is less directness associated with it. And I have never understood why, but I have seen this growing up around me. And, even when I used to get paid for certain concerts, it was like this, like, slip. And I mean, I am working here, so I mean, I don't see why paying me for my job is a secret. But I wonder if that has something to do with the fact that there isn't enough data available because we don't want to talk about it.
Could also be, I think the whole, and we're not talking about, if I think about classical music as an outsider or as someone who is watching it, it's not supposed to be something that is a money making thing to begin with. Like, the common perception is that you're doing it because either you're really good at it, or because you've spent a lot of time getting really good at it. It's not I mean, I very rarely hear people say that this is, I'm doing this as a profession, as maybe someone who works in IT would, like, just to draw a binary. And that's, again, I think we were talking about it in terms of how intrinsic to the person it is to actually follow an art as a profession.
Hmm.
Then, and I think Avanti is going to lead us into the
Yes.
next.
So, in fact, what you're saying also, I can, uh, think of it in a contemporary sense, because the next section is talking about music in our life in contemporary sense. Because all three of us are currently also performers, we're also students of music. And then the next question is addressed to Rutuja. Rutuja, I want to ask you that now that we've discussed so much about the history of classical music, we've discussed a lot about how it was made historically. But in contemporary times, as someone who does Hindustani classical music concerts, how much do you think has changed? And yes, I'm also referring to the fact that this performance space has now moved to a virtual setup given our pandemic. So, how much do you think has changed in firstly the setting of it, and secondly from a gender point of
Yeah. So as we sort of when we speak about the historical perspective and the way women were represented, there is and the social stigma which associated with women performers during those times, it has certainly changed, and there's it's like it needless to say that there is a huge reformation which has taken place when we see the contemporary times. But however, it is also important to acknowledge the challenges and difficulties which is faced by especially women students or performers from less privileged background, who may find themselves in a dangerously vulnerable positions while paving their way through hierarchical structures. So, be it the student-teacher relation, or the fact that if they are practitioners who are not belonging from a privileged background, who can sort of are assured to have that kind of backing in the way they are pursuing their careers. But there are these challenges which are certainly faced by the uh, women practitioners of music, who are relatively not as privileged as we consider ourselves to be.
Rutuja, a follow-up question on that is, when you probably took up music,
Yeah.
uh, did you think about whether or not it will sustain you financially? Was that a thought that you had to consider?
Actually, no, as Rujita rightly pointed, even though it was an outsider's perspective of, not seeing music as as a means to, pursue it professionally, like by talking about money, or, considering the money aspect. So even I must say that for me also, the pursuit of music was more for the fact that I was learning with my with good gurus right from a very tender age. So that that decision of, okay, I'm going to make a career out of it in terms of being able to sustain myself financially, was not essentially a thought behind it, because the motivation behind learning music was more about, like, preserving the tradition which I sort of got it from learning with Tungutai, or that was the motivation. So that the fact that you are acknowledging music as a means of having it as a career stepped in very late in my life, I must say. And it's now it's becoming a a part of my understanding in an organic way, and not something which was I planned it. Okay, I want to ऐसा करना है, उसके बाद में this is how I would see my career grow in terms of earning money. So that's how the transition was very the understanding was very organic, uh, and not something which I had pre-decided.
So this is also, I think, interesting, right? Because when we talk about music as a profession, we also have to think about the fact that it's a service that's going to get us money, right, as artists. So I wonder how to look at it even as a classical musician, because the messaging that we've received growing up is that this music is for the soul. This music is to be studied lifelong. And even when someone asks me, so oh, are you done with your music education, I almost laugh at them, because it's obviously not for me, right? It is something that I actually truly believe is a lifelong journey for me. But when I'm thinking about making it my profession, how do I look at making money out of it? And how do I navigate the spaces that are otherwise, surrounded by this thought that you are a classical musician and your job is to pursue classical music, also equal to learn classical music all your life. But how am I supposed to sustain myself? And
If
that
I
brings, yes,
sorry, if
yes.
I may, as like, I can't help but think of a parallel and also think of how these choices that we make come with so much privilege,
Yeah.
because and anecdotal, but the fact that you can invest this much time and effort and money to an extent into learning something, whether it is even, whether it's for me, whether it's something like anthropology that probably no, like, I don't know how many people do in India, and imagine a career in that, or to sing and to learn this for the rest of your life and to imagine making a career out of it. Career, when I say, implies a monetary return from it, comes with an immense amount of caste privilege also, and class privilege, which, I mean, ties us back into how these spaces, as a result of that messaging that you said, is something that is for the soul, or is something that is lifelong, or is something that is, just supposed to be because it's good for you. It's that messaging which is also othering people, um, which is also doing what, say, maybe those spaces which are available for popular music or for folk music, where people can make money out of it, and not, it's not a lifestyle. It's, I think it's in all of that messaging which we're constantly being told, which we have internalized to an extent. And it's true in, I mean, maybe it's not exactly true, say, as it is for academia and for, classical music, but I can see parallels. Tell me if that doesn't make sense, or if it does.
No, I think you're right, Rujuta, and that's exactly what I was leaning towards. That this is the exact thing which restricts so many people from doing it professionally, right? Because you have to think about how you will support yourself and whether you already have some amount of capital to support yourself, because it's not a field that's going to give you money like that. So this is also a choice, essentially, and this is also, like you said, othering people who don't have financial means to pursue a career in classical music. And this actually brings us to the next question, which I'm going to ask Pavitra, which is that, the structure of teaching and learning in classical music, or let's just say music in general, do you think that the way in which it's taught, let's focus on India, the way in which it's taught in our country, do you think it becomes difficult for outsiders or newcomers to receive training?
Um, for me personally, I think that's a difficult question to answer because there are lots of different uh, perspectives to it. I feel like specifically when you talk about Indian music, there is just that much amount of documentation or documented writing on modules or curriculum that you want to kind of go ahead with, which can standardize the process in some way and make it more accessible for people to come and learn. Having said that, I feel like the lack of standardization is also because of the uniqueness of the individual personality also that you kind of imbibe on, or the kind of self-awareness and introspective journey you take as a student of Hindustani classical music, which is lifelong. So I can't really see Hindustani classical music, which is, and specifically talking about this style, which is kind of put down and standardized, and everyone is accessing the same kind of information. And when I say newcomers or outsiders, they have varied understandings and meanings. Perhaps from the industry itself, looking at it from a social angle, looking at it from a monetary resource privilege, all of those angles. And I feel like I feel like it is a system that is difficult. But having said that, I'm not sure of being able to share an example of an easy system that is accessible. In that sense, I feel like all of these privileges that we're looking at, or that we have, or we don't have, or we think about, already make most things accessible and reachable, attainable. Some sort of tangible space is put on it immediately because of the privilege that we have. So I feel specifically to something like music, the subjective understanding of it, say the lack of a specified standardized curriculum in India, those would be some challenges which make it hard. And also learning in a semi-formal and informal space, especially when you have Guru Shishya Parampara, if you're following that tradition. Those would be some points I would say to make things a little difficult, or would take some time to acclimatize or identify. And it's very easy to get kind of lost in that structure, and it's good to ask for help.
That last bit was such an important little tale that you added, because because the system in itself, like you said, could get overwhelming, right? Because there are so many little aspects of it that have made it what it is today. We're not just talking about, say, releasing a book that would give you the information that you need, you read it and then, oh wow, you've learned. No, we're talking about a tradition, we're talking about a cultural system, we're talking about years and years and years of it having built to what it is today, and someone being initiated into it, right? So it's not going to be as easy uh, to begin.
Yeah. So I think, not talking about not easy, the next question I will address to Avanti. We're moving into the next segment of our session today. And Avanti, according to you, and Pavitra, Rutuja, if there's something you'd like to add to this, please feel free. What are the different ways in which men, because we're talking about gender, but also I think people who have generational power, so people who either were from families that passed on this oral tradition, or either of those things, uh, basically people who are more powerful already, how do they control this industry, or what are the maybe explicit or implicit ways in which it makes it even more difficult, like you mentioned, to navigate through this?
So this is a difficult question to answer because there are so many things here. And when you look at power and access, right? Especially if we talk about gender, I think the very fact that spaces don't have gender representation is a way in which this power is expressed, because it's as simple as that. So many people I've spoken to, so many artists I've spoken to, have told me that they felt uncomfortable because there weren't enough women in the room, or even saying something like, oh, it felt good finally to have another woman in the room. So this in itself is an expression of power, because as a woman, if I'm stepping into a room and seeing that I'm the only one there, I feel weird. And it's not something that I'm consciously feeling necessarily, because like we've all discussed, it's become a part of our lives. And going back to the question of when you were made to feel like you were a woman, this was something that I only in retrospect will be able to answer, because all the spaces that as even a child I was a part of musically were dominated by men, and it had been normalized for me. And only when I started actually working on my independent album, and in 2017 I realized that if I am the only person here in the studio who's a woman, I'm actually working with everybody else who's male. And just because I'm the one doing the album and lending my voice for these songs, I'm a woman, but otherwise there was no reason for there to be another woman in the room. So that in itself is I feel the expression of power. And when you talk about generational power, this is another very interesting thought, because very often I feel like Hindustani classical music um, falls prey to the culture that I call Hanji Hanji culture, which is very problematic. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because just generally in our culture in India, we have things like, oh, this is an elderly person, you must go and touch their feet, or physically show respect to them. But it makes me wonder, have they done anything to earn that respect other than the fact that they're older? you know so this is something problematic, because very often in these cases, men who are highly respected in the field of classical music, uh, hold a certain power, whereby even though you have something to say, you're not going to say it because of the fear and the whole, oh, because you are somebody who holds power, I'm going to agree with you, and it doesn't matter. And this is so common and so problematic, because that's restricting ideas. It's not just about who's in power, it's also about an art form being restricted or being blinkered because of the way these power structures are impacting it. And here it's not just about generational power and men as separate. I would in fact put it together, because we're looking at classical music. The people at the helm of the affairs are, how we talk about white men, cis white men. It's pretty much that. It's powerful men who hold generational power as well,
Yeah.
who control the music.
I think we do want to talk more about power, violence, and related issues. But before that, there is a question from Apurva Gauri, which I want to ask because it's related to everything you just said. And also, we're having such a good time that we are almost at the end of our, allotted time. So, to the listeners here, we might go a little over time. Bear with us. Basically, the question, and I'm going to paraphrase because there are a lot of sub questions within that, is that within the gharana system, what Apurva is saying is that women's exclusion is evident within that system, because it's largely the parent teaching the child, and they have seen a lot of male performers learn from their fathers but not as many female performers. So they're asking that is it a mere coincidence or were daughters left out of the art on purpose? Also, following that, were there any instances where a father specifically chose to teach their daughter and received criticism for that? Do such examples come to mind? And I think it's because we were talking about men and generational power together. It feels like a good point to ask this question. So Rutuja, Pavitra, Avanti, any of you, if you have anything to say to that comes to mind, please do.
So I'd like to say something. One is that we've already discussed, how music was taught and how women were in fact excluded from the process itself. And like Rutuja mentioned, that even if there was a woman in the family of the patron who was hosting a concert, for example, that woman was not allowed to even attend the concert. So this is something that was ingrained in the culture back then. And classical music is heavy on tradition, and it has been, and it still very much is. So these things have trickled down. And we have to remember that the gharana system, as it existed several years ago, doesn't exist in the same form today. And I'm sure Rutuja will be able to shed a lot more light on it. But because of that, gharanas have merely become a stylistic difference, rather than how tightly knit they used to be, to the extent that one person from this gharana was not even allowed to attend concerts or listen to the music from another gharana. So we've come from there to now, where the idea of gharana is also different. And when we talk about an example, I don't know about resistance in this case, but I can think of Pandit Ravi Shankar and Anushka Shankar as an example where uh, she very much is performing today, and he taught her. So I don't know what that entire thing must have been for them at that time, but that's an example.
Yeah, so I would like to just add in here, wherein we think about why why the daughters from the hereditary musicians were not encouraged to learn music. So we cannot have at this point of time it's not possible to give a fixed answer, but we would like to ask few questions that would would this be a possibility, because the way arts were associated with women performers, was that the major stigma which was associated with women and learning learning Hindustani music, which sort of proved as a barrier of not letting their daughters to pursue the art? Was that one of the factor which sort of discouraged women musicians from the hereditary families to sort of pursue their career. And often I also have this question that the way court musicians, like the male court musicians, were termed as Raj Gayaks. So why weren't there Raj Gayikas at that time? There were women court musicians, but were they addressed as Raj Gayikas? And why? So these were just fleeting questions which sort of give us an idea about uh, how there was discrimination which existed then. But of course, it's important to sort of study and get our facts in place to be able to sort of have a valid argument which will support this.
Yeah. I feel like we had a comment which said that gender doesn't matter. If you're good, people will dance to your tune. And maybe I'm going to speak on behalf of everybody here, but we wouldn't be having this conversation if gender did not matter. And if, if whether you're good or not was the only thing that, made you good or not. But I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. And Rituja, because I think of the three of you, you have been learning for a significantly and a longer time, possibly. Um, the system of teaching and learning, like you said, whether it's a guru shishya parampara or that bond between a teacher and a student, where you're almost revering the teacher, in a lot of cases, whether it's classical dance or music, there are several spaces in which your guru is almost equal to God, is almost comparable to God. um, how can we contextualize, say, violence or sexual harassment, which is intrinsically linked to power, right, in a system that puts a teacher and a student in this relation? And maybe you can shed some light on that. um yeah.
Full answer. Yeah. So shall I begin?
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's basically ingrained in the fear of challenging the perceived sanctimonious nature of the art form. you know, is one of the major barriers which prevents the field of Hindustani music to gain a momentum to address these issues, to address the hierarchies which are so much deeply embedded. To also find a strong voice in for the women performers, like for women musicians, to address these embedded power structures, which fails to even acknowledge the discrepancies, especially in an informal atmosphere, which we all know, which exists in the field of Hindustani music, be it the way you learn the music, but the way you also, people just see the stage, but there's a lot more happening behind the stage, which is not often accounted to. So and this constitutes these spaces also constitutes a huge part of the professional functionality of the music field. So yeah, these are the issues which needs to be at least reflected on, or put out there, so that people acknowledge that things happen. And yeah, I would just stop here. I
Yeah, I think if you or if Pavitra or Avanti want to add to that, you can. But I just want to add another, and this is something that came through a lot of conversations with Avanti also, that what is preventing, say, the field of classical music from having its own Me Too movement, or it's, an uptick in people coming out and talking about violence or of sexual harassment. So, Avanti, if you want to begin, and or Pavitra or
Yeah,
Rituja
I'd
also.
like to
Yeah.
begin because I feel like this is very relevant. Classical music has attempted to have its Me Too movement several times. It's not that it hasn't. One example is Carnatic music a couple of years ago had its Me Too movement, and it did uh, bring a lot of artists, it did call out a lot of artists on their actions. And Hindustani music is likely to have a Me Too movement given the recent occurrences in the Drupad Sansthan. So, for those who don't know, the Drupad Sansthan, the Drupad Gaiki is like how we know of Hindustani classical music, we know of a form called Khyal Gaiki, which is what we dominantly hear today in Hindustani classical music. But if we go back a couple of years, before Khyal Gaiki was popular, Drupad Gaiki was popular. And recently, and Drupad Gaiki is pretty much a dwindling art form in today's times because Khyal Gaiki has become that much more popular. So, little context about that. So, there's a Drupad Sansthan where they teach Drupad music in a Gurukul system, and a Gurukul system refers to students living there basically and receiving talim from their gurus in the same space. And the idea of a Gurukul system is that the student is supposed to take care of the guru, and the guru in return is supposed to give them vidya, right? And obviously things have changed a lot now, and there's not just the aspect of this exchange, but there's also the aspect of money which comes in. And now coming to the Me Too allegations. So in the Drupad Sansthan, a couple of students came out and spoke about sexual harassment and violence. And it happened on Facebook, and there is now a probe into the matter, and people are looking into it. The right authorities are looking into it. But I feel like that example in itself should make us think about how classical music is being taught, because the very nature of it is, like you said, revering the guru. Where do we draw the line as a student? And I personally very strongly feel like we must, because here we're talking about physical abuse, sexual abuse, violence, but a lot of the stories that will be narrated to you about musicians who spend hours or days or years trying to get the attention of their guru or get their guru to teach them, and for that they went to what lengths. Those stories get claps and applause, and we have to dig a little deeper and think about the fact that that was really abuse, that was psychological abuse. So are we, as a tradition of music, celebrating psychological abuse under the name of teaching? And then is it our responsibility, in fact it is, to separate anecdotes like these from reality? Because we have to remember that these anecdotes are very close to reality, so we can't forget that they happened. But when we talk about it today, we have to be very sensitive and think about multiple factors concerning it.
Also, before either of you respond, and I think you should because we'd really like to know what you think about it. But an important point to think about what Avanti said is that because it's a tradition, because often children get into this when they're very young, and then if again we're not going to talk about it, we are talking about a generation of learners who have I mean who start quite young. I mean, when did all of you start learning with your gurus? Yeah, five is a very young age. It's before four. It's before you can even like all of you said, right? It's not when you are thinking of what is coming your way or what are the experiences you're having. A lot of these conversations are in retrospect. But there are children right now who are starting training, who are getting into this tradition of learning and teaching. And for them also, it's important for us to have these, and you all to have these conversations. But yes, Pavitra, if you want to chime in here.
Sure. And just to kind of give my thoughts on the last few questions that we've discussed. One is, I feel, in specifically in my observation of creative fields, access has been the most prevalent wielding of power, in terms of, whether you're starting out or you're established, the kind of access that you have or the access that you have access to that kind of defines a lot of the power structures. And in terms of contextualizing perhaps violence or harassment in these kind of structures, I would say it would be contextualized the same way any other case of violence or sexual harassment is contextualized. Just if you remove the Hindustani classical art form from it, the remaining parameters quite remain the same. Where we do have an added level of mystery, I would say, is because we revere the art form so much. So a lot of it gets mixed in that space. And I feel like it's, and whether, and this is my personal opinion, whether it's a formal space or an informal space in which we perhaps operate more in this kind of a system, the idea of violence and sexual harassment is still the same. And I would kind of stand up against it in either case. I don't feel that perhaps because it is an informal space, it should give more space for such instances to happen. And so those are my thoughts. And also, with the last question of the Me Too movement, Avanti has pretty much shared the thoughts I had, but also the idea of when you put that Hindustani classical music art form or the music or the art form, whatever it is, back in place, that becomes a big deterrent in kind of standing up, because you have generations of an art form that you are kind of part of, and you're also nurturing and learning yourself, which nurtures you as well. So I think those become important thinking points, and those become really points of confusion, points of a lot of, it takes time to reflect on and to isolate this from that and to see things as they are. And I think those are my thoughts about, in general, the ideas of power, violence, and sexual harassment.
Yeah, as Pavitra rightly pointed, the difficulty of being able to isolate the which what happened in Drupad Samsthan and the form which we see. So it was pretty much when I just I also spoke in length with Avanti about about what has happened and about my thoughts of how I sort of reacted in the first place when I got to know about this. So, to actually be able to see it in generally, and not just, associating it this with an art form, and then, so that was pretty much a lesson for me to just be able to sink in the fact that this happens. And, so that was my first reaction, and a sort of a reflection which gave a lot of sort of a lesson, कि ये ध्रुपद है तो मतलब the art, and I remember Avanti's quote that art and art form, they are different, so artist and the art form, so they both are different. So the fact that these things were surfaced was not new. They did exist, and it would be, if I say ki, okay, I'm utterly shocked, then I would be in denial that, to accept that these things do take place in the Hindustani music field. So yeah, these things, when they were surfaced, it kind of gave a sort of a wake up call to just not isolate Hindustani music on a pedestal, wherein you deny that these things won't happen.
I feel like that's the, I mean, and after this, Sanchi will be coming in and concluding. But again, to contextualize it in terms of how do we understand this, there's a difference between a profession or a way of life and actual people who carry out that profession and a way of life. And I feel like people are bound to do things that are wrong, or people are bound to, make mistakes, hurt other people, abuse people, harass people, victimize people. Uh, and when we forget to make that distinction between structures and systems and people who actually carry out those structures and systems, who are deeply flawed sometimes, that's when, when we conflate the two, is when we need that, I think, reminder that, they're not the same thing. And it could be, right now we're talking about music, but very frankly, this could apply to any field. It could be a scientist for that matter, because you think science is rational and logical and, above everything else, but you will have scientists who are casteist, who are racist, who are sexist, who are, classist, and who are abusers also. And it's not because, they're, I mean, they're not all rational, logical. They can't also be. So I think that is just, to contextualize in the broader framework. Yes, Pavitra.
I wanted to add one more thing in case people are interested to help contextualize, especially the idea, the recent allegations that were brought up. Shubhaji and Anishji posted a note about this, which helped me contextualize this particular situation a lot, not just on what happened or what is experienced, but what also are we looking at to do about it, or what are possible repercussions of this, what we should be looking at, or just questions about what we want to see in the future with regard to such things happening and how it impacts not just the survivors, but also the people who are propagating this kind of violence. So if anyone's interested, that helped me contextualize and thought I'd share that with you all.
I think Sanchi.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're almost at the end of our session, and we'd like to conclude with this question we got from Anita Patel. And I feel like this is a really great way to conclude the session, because we've been talking about the problems and the challenges in the industry. We're talking about the things that we've experienced and faced, but we want to end with a little positivity and talk about the road ahead, the way ahead, and what we can do about these things. So Anita Patel asked, how is each panelist planning to navigate this? Do they follow a plan or strategy? Do they have any advice to their colleagues? How do they plan to bring about a change? Couple of sub questions, but if the three of you want to just respond to this or any part of this, and yeah, Avanti.
So I think also taking from the previous discussion that we had, what do we do in such cases when we have allegations against an artist, and uh, what systems do we have in place? So as I see it, the first and most important thing is for event organizers and promoters of classical music to be conscious and aware of the fact that bringing a performer to your stage who may have allegations against them is a risky thing to do, mainly because you're promoting it in a manner, you're not acknowledging that something needs to be done about it. And this is something that I really feel strongly about, because I have seen this happen in multiple institutions, and it's almost like then you're sweeping it under the carpet. Let's not do that. So I think as a collective, this is something we need to think about. And that brings us to, then what do we do if there are allegations against somebody? Do we just say that, okay, no, you're a bad person, and I'm going to ostracize you, and stop, just go? No, we also have to think about how are we going to bring about reform. It's not just about ensuring someone goes behind bars. In fact, it shouldn't be. It should be about bringing out reform. Are we trying to you know have counseling? Are we trying to have any sort of therapy associated with the people who have been accused of violence? Because here we very often hear only in the sense of what the victim has gone through, and that in itself is problematic. We need to sort of broaden our approach a little and look at how the system can help cases of sexual harassment and violence, and if there are systems in place that will help people to firstly reach out and make formalized complaints about it, and then secondly to have reformative and corrective action in manners of therapy and in manners of counseling. I think that that's something that the world needs. And as for the rest of the questions, um, uh, do we have a plan? Well, yes and no. The plan is to keep pursuing music, to be very frank. And in my case, to keep upskilling, because there's so much I don't know and there's so much that I keep wanting to learn. And when it comes to I feel like as musicians we have a responsibility of sort of sharing our knowledge with people as well. Some of us do it through our concerts, some of us decide to teach. For me it's also teaching, and I do feel like being a responsible artist comes with trying to instill these values along with music to the people who learn music from me. And I feel like that's a great way of reaching out to them.
Thank you, Avanti. Rituja, do you have something to add?
So I'll completely echo to what Avanti and Pavitra and whatever the discussion took place in terms of developing a perspective is an ongoing thing, and to be able to sort of widen and develop our perspective is one thing which you can engage, and that's a never ending thing. Also, to sort of creating a space, and each and every artist has that power to create that space. It is not important how professionally on how you're placed, but each and every artist, regardless of he or she being a teacher, being a performer, they have the power to sort of create a change of wave in the way things can be changed, in the way it's important to how the change of perception is needed. So each and every artist has in themselves, they have the power to sort of impact that change in their own small way.
Pavitra?
I'm going to go last. Okay. So I'll just, I think, want to highlight two things that I think work for me very well. One is being constantly engaged in the process of learning and unlearning, and accepting the ideas of putting yourself in a place of also ignorance, or accepting that you may also have a lot of these biases. Even if you stand up for such conversation and you do speak out, you might still hold a lot of things subconsciously or consciously that you might want to unlearn, relearn, kind of work on. So acceptance is the first. And the second would be just to ask for help. And I can't emphasize on this enough, because asking for help means different things to different people, and whatever that means to you, please go ahead and do that, because there is strength and power in sharing, and there is strength and power in letting everybody or whoever you want to know that this is something hard that you're experiencing, just to understand the perspectives of other people who might tell you you're not the only one, and might be able to suggest things that you can do to either speak out about it or move out of something like that, or just share their perspective of it. Even listening helps. So please ask for help. So those would be the two things I'd like to share.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a really good note to end this session on, to ask for help, and that's actually underscores what our efforts here at Academicish and at Eq.Vox are, to create these collaborative spaces, to create these collaborative networks, and amplify voices that are left out by the mainstream. And we're really glad that Rutuja, Pavitra, Avanti, you took time out of your busy schedules and came here, and Avanti for collaborating with us on the questions as well. And this was one of our attempts at diversifying what the word academic means, because we think of academic as something that's theory laden, something that's very dry, dense, inaccessible. But this is by holding sessions like this is our attempt at doing away with that image and talking about academic from the lived experiences of people, the lived experiences of practitioners in the field, because what you are doing is making meaning, is making theories. So that's also very important to study. Those narratives are still important to study, like Rusta said. And thank you to our audience for coming to this session. And we were a little we're I think 10 minutes ahead of schedule, but that's okay. Thank you for bearing with us. And just wanted to add that we expected some confusion to happen between Rujita and Rutuja, but it did not happen. So I think we should just like give our We should just give ourselves an applause because that went smoothly. But yeah, thank you so much for attending. And Rusa, if you have anything to add, or Avanti, you can just.
I think you asked about the way ahead and for asking for help, and this is whether it's academic-ish or whether it's Avanti with Eq.Vox, this is our attempt to scream into the void that is the internet and ask people for help to ask people to see if how they're seeing the world, how they're understanding it, and to just share and create more of these spaces. So I think do come in, like I want to put this out as an invitation for people to come in and get in touch with us, interact with us on Instagram. I've put in our handles in the chat box, or just write to us. And yeah, we really want to listen to as many
We're
people.
actually doing, so we hold academic-ish holds weekly discussions where we do a reading on a particular thematic, and
Academic reading, but we contact, like, yeah.
yeah, and then we
You'll
come
understand.
together as a group and discuss it. And this month we're actually doing music.
Yes.
And this Sunday we have a discussion on gender and caste assertions in holy songs in North India. And we
Yeah.
talk about different things like the Bhabi they were born, and like the role of technologies. And we the session next week is about protest music in Pakistan. The bands like Junoon and things like that. So yeah, we have a couple of interesting sessions planned. So if you're interested, please write to us or check out our Instagram page where you can sign up. And
Yeah. Avanti, if you want to
I'd like
add
to say
closing
thank
remarks.
you to everyone, literally everyone. And no, it's really important that people firstly have these conversations. Then it's important that people listen to these conversations. And for that very reason, I'm saying thank you to everyone who is present here. And I think Sanchi and Rujuta are really, really committed to academic ish and making academic readings accessible to people, academic discussions accessible to people who otherwise might have been intimidated by it. And I think that's very close to the cause of Eq.Vox as well, where very often when people talk about gender and they talk about issues related to gender, the stuff you read is often jargonized and full of heavy words that are difficult to understand. So with Eq.Vox and understanding of individual life experiences of different artists, we hope that it helps you think a little bit, and these experiences help you follow your dreams, because that's really what art is about, to be able to create something that that's here to actually bring it out. So that's what Eq.Vox is all about. And thank you to Academic-ish for doing this collaboration so beautifully and having us all here.
thank you. Thank you again, Pavitra and Rituja and Avanti.
Most
Thank
Can we
you.
welcome.
click a picture
Thanks,
before we
everyone.
go? We can stop recording and then